This is a discussion on words, okay? We're here to try to define the word, if you will, white privilege. What does it mean? Some will approach that from a subconscious way or a psychological way. There are other definitions. There are multiple realities we're looking at here. And what we're trying to do is build a forum where we can interact and talk with each person so that we can clarify what we're talking about. Because somebody might be talking up here, somebody might be talking down there, and they're not talking to each other. They're just making words at each other. So let's try to form that sense of understanding of what it is that we're talking about. So my job, we welcome you. The whole idea is mutual discipline. The whole idea is personal respect, because we're talking about something that affects all of us, whether we're aware of it or not. And let's try to clarify what we mean when we talk about white privilege. Okay. There is an order that we're going to speak in. Chris, are you ready to open the things up? I'm going to ask Chris to open the conversation, and she will identify herself. And let's go with it, Chris.
So I'm Chris Eby. I'm the geology professor at JCC. I am a very lost geologist, apparently, at this moment, because this is not my discipline or expertise at all. I'm really happy to see so many people here that I recognize. I see a lot of members, not only of the current Jefferson community. I see at least one former student who just smiled at me. I see a bunch of my church members. I see a lot of community activists in ecology and social justice. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. In the classroom, I'm Dr. Eby. Here, I'm really just Chris. I am another white American trying to figure this out in a very complicated world. White privilege is a difficult topic, and today I'm going to try to keep from demonizing anyone or painting any group, whether it's a racial group or a political group, with any kind of broad brush. I've included my email. You can see that in my name right down here. And I want you to hold me to that. If at some point I say something that strikes you as unempathetic or thoughtless or uncaring, I want you to call me on it, and I want you to tell me, and I'm willing to listen to your side of the story. I think it's important for us to discuss white privilege for the same reason why some fire alarms went off at a friend's house recently. So I was cooking at a friend's house and using his oven, and a bunch of fire alarms went off. And I said, "Hey man, I think we got to clean this oven." And he said, "Hey, don't shame my oven. Don't shame me for not keeping up with my oven." I said, "No, the point isn't to guilt you or shame you into cleaning your oven. The point is the oven is dirty enough that the fire alarms are going off." And I think that's very much what we're dealing with race in this country right now. The fire alarms are definitely going off. There's something wrong, and we need to talk about it honestly and directly. And it's not about guilt. It's not about shaming anyone. It's not about making people feel bad, because those feelings don't fix anything. It's about talking about how this society was largely built by white people. And because of that, there are biases built into the system. And we'll be identifying some of those biases tonight. For myself, I feel it's very important as a white American to not only talk about these things, but to listen. So one of the things I'm hoping for myself personally is to learn from the other panelists and learn from all of you, from your questions, from your concerns, and from your thoughts. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. I would like to invite Ron to speak in the second place here. Ron Palmer.
Thank you, Jerry. And thank you for moderating this, my old colleague. I'm going to come at this slightly differently, and words are political. They have meaning. They have meaning in combinations. They're chosen for reasons, and they have impact. And I think that the goal here is understanding. I find that sometimes words can be used to build bridges to understanding, but often words can also represent minefields, which prevent reaching that goal. And so I'm going to try to address, from kind of a personal perspective almost, that I think the term white privilege is received in a way which is detrimental to the understanding that it is sought. All right. And I'm going to be honest with you, and I'm not going to ask anyone to be honest. And it's not like one of those come in the meetings, right? But the idea is, listen honestly, I guess, or at least think honestly in terms of the understanding that's sought. To me, I reacted when the word white privilege initially emerged. I was offended, to be honest, because not going into deep, but my own background, I feel like I was the first Palmer ever to go to college. I worked multiple jobs to go through school while, I got financial aid. And to me, white privilege had this notion of economics, that somehow what I had done, I didn't deserve. And that's because the focus is wrong. It's not really an economic issue. And in this last couple of years, I've come to realize that what white privilege really means is my problem is the word privilege. Because I think really what the understanding I seek is that they're basic human rights of some which I have always benefited from and have taken for granted. But the goal is not to remove those rights from me, but they should be extended to all, right? And that's really what's being sought. And so when you hear white privilege and your hackles go up because you feel that you're not privileged, it takes to, while I can't comprehend, I can try to understand the concern of being pulled over at 2:00 in the morning by myself in a car. As other fellow human beings in my society, I cannot understand that apprehension, that fear, or of a parent whose son or daughter goes out. Right? That's something that no one should experience. And the white privilege, I think, often will, as Chris was, asserting kind of earlier, the reaction can be almost a sense of a shaming. And I think that turns off the argument. And I hope we can overcome that obstacle, that minefield, to the shared understanding I think most of us would gladly and loudly embrace. And I don't know what time that is, but I'll stop there.
Your time was great. I would like to call upon Ed Small at this time, the third of our panelists, to introduce himself and then give us his introductory remarks.
Good afternoon. Good evening, I'm sorry. I'm Ed Smalls. I'm an instructor at JCC for Criminal Justice and Homeland Security. I'm also a retired military member for 28 years. White privilege isn't an American thing. I've been to many countries and I've experienced it. And from a personal standpoint, I believe it's more like a latent experience. Most people who get white privilege, they don't even know they're getting it. They don't understand it. They don't know what's happening around them. Jerry said multiple realities, which is true because we can be in a similar situation and experience that situation completely and utterly different, right? Ron made the statement that words matter. It does matter, and especially being up here in the North Country, most of my friends are white. And we hang out, and most of my friends are Trump guys, and we go back and forth. And when we talk about certain issues, certain things are sticking points because the term white privilege to them means that they're being attacked because something's being taken away from them. And Ron was right. It's nothing trying to be taken away. It's basically trying to give that same type of feeling to everyone in our society. I remember when I was in 6th grade, and I'll give my one personal story and be done. I was in a magnet class, and I was the only Black kid there. And we went around the class, and the teacher asked all the kids what they wanted to be when they grew up. And kids were talking about being president and all these things and CEOs. And I didn't know what to say because when my peers, their parents were telling them they could rule the world, my father was telling me I have to be careful of the world. With white privilege, the understanding we talk about the talk in a Black family. My father told me when what I ought to do and what I needed to do when confronted with law enforcement. My white friends never had that. Some people laugh. Some of my friends laugh when we go out, and I've been followed in stores. You know, I've been looked at funny, like, "Why are you here?" And the experience is completely and utterly shocking to my friends when they experience it with me. And so I think it comes from the exposure of different cultures that will help this, because when you're exposed to it, you have a better understanding of the other person's feelings or how they're looking at or being looked at. And so it is a human thing. It has nothing to do with economics. You know, it has to do with someone pulling me over and treating me with like a high risk traffic stop, you know, with his hands on his guns while he's asking me for my license. And I'm a retired cop. And so as long as we keep this dialogue going and we learn to share our experiences and hope to understand each other's experiences, I believe we can work through this and build those bridges that Ron spoke about. That's my time.
Thank you, Ed. And finally, we have, yes, it's Becky's turn. I introduce to you Becky Ream, who will introduce herself.
Yes, hi. I teach sociology at JCC, and I want to compliment Ed and Ron, Chris, for what they've said. And I've got a little PowerPoint I'm going to get going here because I want to make a point about how long this term has been around and maybe how long it's taken for it to assume the importance that we have. Yeah, can I, next slide. Okay, first of all, it's a much maligned concept. And Ron referred to some of that. It doesn't mean that working class or poor white people have never struggled. It doesn't mean that they haven't earned their achievements. Next. It helps to understand the origins of the term. Some people think of it as a zero-sum game, and that's a little bit like what Ron was talking about. That implies that if one group wins, another group must lose. So maybe white men believe that African Americans and women too win, therefore they must lose something, but that's not true. Life isn't a zero-sum game, even though we might think about it that way sometimes. Next slide. Peggy McIntosh originated the term in 1989, and this is her definition. She says it's like an invisible backpack that people carry around with them, and that white people can sort of pull things out of this backpack as they're going through life. Next. There are other more complicated definitions of the term, like this is a more formal definition of the term that's used by the Anti-Racist Workshop. But you know, I think Peggy McIntosh put it on the put it well, thinking that it's like a backpack that white people carry around with them that they can dip into on occasion as they go through life. Next. And it exists because of history. It exists in subtle power relationships between people. It's manifested in everyday life. And Ed told you some of that. These are some examples here. There's an assumption when we think about society that white is normal and that African American and other peoples are compared to that normal whiteness. And we have a term in sociology, we call this the normalization of whiteness. Yes, and it's just recently, in the past few years in sociology, the sociologists have started to identify white as a term that applies to people the same way that African American or Black applies to people. Whiteness is subject to analysis now. Next. One example of the persistence over time of white privilege is the racial wealth gap. And I've got some figures for you there. Median wealth of white households, 141,000, Black households, 11,000. And college education doesn't narrow that gap. Studies have shown the median white person has 7.2 times the wealth of the median Black person. The gap is due to inherited wealth. It is intergenerational wealth that builds wealth in American society. And white people, as a population, have had more historical time to accumulate wealth than African Americans, because up until 1865, Africans were the property of white slave owners, and they could not accumulate property or wealth to pass on to their descendants, because until 1865, they were property. Then came Jim Crow laws until the late 1960s. And redlining prevented Black households from home ownership, mortgages to acquire a home or hire if you're African American. And all of those things go into making it more difficult for Black families to accumulate intergenerational wealth. Next. That's an economic example. Go to the next slide. I've got a link there to a list of situations that amount to privileges white Americans have that don't apply to Black Americans. White Americans generally do not, as listed there. And as Ed talked about, a couple of those. But think of having to deal with those Karens calling 911 on you when you're just out in the street minding your own business. Or worry that an employer won't hire you because your name is outside of the usual English lexicon. Next. And it's serious because white privilege is a matter of life and death. White Americans are twice as likely to survive their first year of life in comparison to Black Americans. That's because the infant mortality rate for African Americans is twice that for white Americans, even controlling for social class, access to healthcare, etc. This results in the fact that Black men have a life expectancy 4 years lower than white men in America. And in some inner city areas, it's even worse. In Chicago, for example, there's a 30-year gap between when a white man can expect to die and when a Black man can expect to die. Black women are more likely to have problems in childbirth than white women. So it is literally a matter of life and death beyond just the problems of police shootings. Next. So think about your situation, and many of us out there in the audience are white. Think about if you're white, the last time security followed you around when you were shopping. Or you were pulled over for a traffic ticket. Were you afraid of being shot? Did you have to have a talk, like Ed mentioned, with your white sons when they reached driving age? Besides the regular, no, be respectful to the police and all that, yeah. But the talk that Ed mentioned is not a talk that white families generally engage in. Did you pay more for your mortgage because you're not white? Did the bank limit where you could afford a home? Or when was the last time you were the only one at a job, at a party, in a classroom? White Americans don't have to represent the white race the way that Black Americans are often thought of as represented, as representations of all African Americans in a particular situation. White privilege is hidden, it's unrecognized. It's these things that benefit whites, but harm African Americans. And that about concludes what I want to say. It's just a usual sociology presentation. And then we can go to questions, or Margaret, we can go back to the presentation. Thank you. Thank you.
And thank you, Becky. Okay, first of all, let's open it to the panel now, the four who have spoken. If you have any specific questions or personal experience that can add to what has already been said, now's your time. If not, I'll give you some of my own, but I'll open that to the panelists first. Let's go with that. Yes, Chris.
So, two things that stuck out to me were Ed's comment about understanding how someone feels when they feel exposed, or, you know, a Black person, a little bit tied to what Becky was saying about being the only, you know, person of your race in a party. I've gone to quite a few parties where I was the only white person there. And although overwhelmingly it was a positive experience, there were a couple of incidents that made me very uncomfortable, where someone confronted me and started asking me all these questions and justifying every white person that ever whited in the history of whiteness, you know. And that's a very uncomfortable situation to be in. So, you know, what Ed was saying about empathy stuck out to me. What Becky was saying about, you know, thinking about your culture as normal. You know, I'm blessed. I am from Chicago. I'm glad Becky did bring up Chicago. That is my experience. And so I was really, really blessed that my best friend since the second grade is Latina. And you know, so that, you know, going over to her house and trying tamales for the first time, growing up in a Polish household, it was pretty crazy. It was a great experience, you know, tasting food that tasted like stuff was awesome. Not that Polish food isn't awesome, it's great, but the flavors are butter and pepper. So, and a little bit of salt. But, you know, when I come here into the North Country, and it's you know, it's an overwhelmingly white population, you know, I'm much more aware that there's limits to what's in the grocery store, and a sense of that what's here and what's North Country is what's normal. Not that that's bad, but it's an idea that I think that needs to be, it's not intentionally bad, there's nothing evil about it, but it's an assumption that I think needs to be questioned more.
Another panelist with a comment or a question. Yes, Ed.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk about a conversation I was having with a female in regards to white privilege, and she tried to put it in a different perspective so she could understand it. And I liked what she used. She was like, this type of privilege, it's latent. It's not manifested. You can't see it, but it's there. And when it's there and you can't see it, doesn't mean it doesn't exist. She said it's almost like men who walk at night to their cars back and forth without an issue, but not knowing how a woman would feel. Right. Because she talked about having her keys out, always having her phone, because her experience in a similar situation is completely different and her expectations of things were different. And I thought that was a great example of how she tried to make it relate so she can understand it.
That's cool. Other panelists. I couldn't say, oh, Becky, there you are. Go ahead, Becky Ream.
There we go. Yeah, I just a question for Ed. Well, anybody, actually. Why are women afraid in parking lots at night? This I cannot figure. Why are you afraid in a parking lot at night? Why?
Does a woman want to answer that?
Because I'm not.
You're one of the very few I know. Okay, Chris, go ahead.
So this is an ugly incident, but when I was going to college, a woman was gang raped by 5 men and murdered. And I was going to college at UIC. I was in the city. I got to say, I am not afraid of Watertown. But there's reasons to be afraid to go to your car at night. I mean, that was a real attack that happened while I was a graduate student in the same parking lot that I used. So, I mean, it happens.
I understand it happens, and it's reasonable to exercise caution. That's not unreasonable. One must exercise caution, and females need to be more cautious in some circumstances than males. But to be afraid in Watertown in a parking lot at night, I don't think that's
She
necessary
didn't, I'm
fear.
sorry. She didn't just say Watertown. And the thing is, the fear is there. Just because someone else doesn't have it, doesn't mean it doesn't
It's real.
exist, right?
Understand?
And it's real. It's just
Don't
like,
interrupt each
why-
other, please. And you're
Yes.
talking.
Mhm.
yes. It's like, why am I afraid when a siren goes off behind me and I've done nothing wrong? You know, it's not rational. People will look at it and don't understand it because they don't experience those types of emotion. It's a physiological change in my body.
Yeah.
When I get pulled over.
Yeah.
You know, and so, and I'm not saying I'm the only person and I'm special about it, but these things happen. I say it's like oxygen. Just because you don't see it doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
Yeah. Becky?
As the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant on the panel, I also get sweaty and clammy and fumble for my insurance card, but I don't have the same level. I know I'm more worried whether I can talk my way out of it rather whether I'll be taken out of it. So you know, I'm not equating. I'm just saying there is a level of anxiety with authority that's shared amongst all groups. If I could go a little academic for just a second, but go back to that minefield thing I talked about initially. Becky, I have a problem, and help walk me through it maybe. When Peggy McIntosh, when she refers to like unearned rights, and when you use like, my problem is when you use word like a privilege, meaning that I don't have a fear of being shot. I think that's where the privilege word trips me up. Because I consider that a basic human right. That we're all endowed by our creator under this system with certain. Now they've not applied. I get that, but can you identify me what are unearned rights? Because I think that trips me up. It's kind of like, in a broader way, I know from a sociological perspective, the word racist only can apply to those who have power, and it's a white power structure. Therefore, only whites can be racist, and some would even say that all whites then must be racist. I don't share any of that. I'm not saying you do, but when people hear that, my reaction is I know racist people who aren't white, and so I'm able to reject out front what you're saying because I can find counter examples. Now, that may well be, then you have to get in discussion what is prejudice versus what is racism, because prejudice surely exists across the globe and is directed at different colored people by different colored people in various terrible combinations. But if we're not careful, it allows for folks to basically put their hand up and walk away when you start to stumble over terms. So could you give me an idea what is an unearned right in this context, I guess?
Who are you talking to, Ron?
To Becky Ream
Yeah.
with her slide.
Maybe what she means, and I can't put words in her mouth, what you can do
Right.
is, and I was going to suggest this, is just Google Peggy McIntosh and go to the website of the organization that she now runs. And maybe you have a difficulty with the word privilege because perhaps it has a meaning different to you now than it had to her in 1988 when she came up with the term. Well, as far as
I'm
an
referring
unearned
to
right,
rights.
An
Repeatedly,
unearned
she refers to rights, and that's what rights do. What are unearned
Ron,
rights?
excuse me, Ron, you're
I have,
interrupting. You're interrupting Becky. Becky,
Sorry.
were you
Sorry,
there?
I apologize.
It's okay.
okay.
Becky, were you-
Yeah, I think that perhaps an example of an unearned right would be the right to feel unthreatened by authority. So at the traffic stop example, white people are less likely, and you experience some anxiety, yes, but you don't experience the kind of trepidation, the kind of gut-wrenching fear that a Black man feels at a traffic stop. That's an unearned right. It's nothing that you did personally to earn the right not to feel afraid at that traffic stop. It's just something that happens because of the structure of the way the society has treated African Americans since 1619.
Chris Eby.
It helps if I turn my mic on. So I used Google to look up Merriam-Webster's definition of privilege. And a privilege is just a right or immunity granted as a peculiar benefit, advantage, or favor. It doesn't say anything about being earned or unearned. It doesn't say anything about, unjustified or justified or anything like that. So I could say that my education is a privilege. And that's something I'm very aware of. And before I came on this panel, I'm like, how am I going to talk about white privilege when I am a homeowner, which is a privilege? I am highly educated, which is a privilege. Not that I didn't work towards those things, but those are privileges. I had a family that deeply supported education and believed that even though they weren't educated, I could get educated. That's a privilege. So how can I talk about this when I'm coming from such a privileged position, especially when so many of my students are very not privileged? And so many of the people I know in my church aren't privileged, even if they have white privilege because they're white, but they're all these other privileges that I'm blessed to have, they don't have. And I think that being aware of that is really important. One example of white privilege here in the North Country, I was walking with one of my friends from the DEC, and we bumped into this older gentleman, white gentleman, who was fishing. And we got into a little conversation and talking about wonderful fishing opportunities, all that kind of stuff. I said, hey, I'm from Chicago. And he starts going off on single mothers from Chicago, single moms in Chicago. There's a big problem in this country, sucking down on the system, all that kind of stuff. And I listened to him very quietly. I didn't agree or disagree. I did the thing that I try to do all the time, which is listen. And I let him finish. And we talked a little bit more about fishing and resources and resource management and that kind of stuff. And when we said good day, I said, and I'd just like to introduce myself. I'm Dr. Chris Eby, daughter of a single mother from Chicago. Now, the thing is, he wasn't talking about me when he was talking about single moms from Chicago being a major problem in this country. I can walk around and people will assume that I have two parents and will assume, because of the way that I speak and the way that I act, I'm treated very respectfully by police officers. Sometimes they apologize to me, because I'm well dressed and I'm white and I'm a woman, and I'm well educated and I speak very well. The assumption would go the other way, no matter, even if I were Black, the assumption would run around the other way, that I had come from this particularly deprived environment, that I didn't have two parents, that I didn't have this, that I didn't have that. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. But there's this whole assumption going on about what kind of cultures we come from and where we come from. And I can move from one culture to another, from a lower socioeconomic class to another, and hide that very easily and move through society, upper levels of society very easily, in part because I am white.
Thank you, Chris. Other comments on this? We're well within our time plan, if you will. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some personal experience on my own, too, and I'll be very brief. When I was 12 years, I was raised in New Jersey, a little town called Nutley, about 15 miles west of New York City, on the continent, if you will. All white community, What was interesting, it was mostly immigrants, second generation immigrants who had made it, worked their tails off, and gotten out of the Lower East Side of Manhattan and had moved over to New Jersey. And boy, were they proud of what they had achieved. And my father was one of those. I remember one time when I was 12 years old that my father got a phone call. He said, "I'll be right there." Went out to the front steps. I looked out the bay window and I looked up and down the street and I saw that every house, the father of the house, and it makes me worked up. On every doorstep, there was a white male standing there, many of them with their hands crossed across their chests. They were waiting. Down the street came a real estate broker in a nice car, and out of the side, because across the street from me was a nice little house for sale. Across the street from me, they parked, and out of the back seat stood this tall, very elegant black man, and he walked around to the other side to open the door for his wife. And his wife started to get up, and as she was getting up, he looked up and down the street, and he just said something to her. She got right back into the car. He walked right around the other side of the thing, got back in, and off they drove. Okay, that is something that would never, ever have happened to a white person. Never. My second experience was about 15 years ago. The other side of the coin. I'm a preacher. I do a lot of public speaking. I do a lot of meetings and stuff like that. I got an invitation to the AME church here, which is predominantly an African American church here in Watertown, or it was. I'm not sure if it's operating anymore. It was their 126th anniversary. I was proud to go there. I expect it would be kind of like a hors d'oeuvres and people passing things around. That was my expectation. I got there and they were just starting a service. And I was the only white person in that whole room of 200 black people. And you know something, for the first time in my life, I realized what it was like to not have privilege, because I started to sweat. The people were very kind, very welcoming. They asked me to say something. I said something kind of fumbling around about how lucky they were and how wonderful it was their 126th anniversary. But I felt for the first time, I think, in my life, that I had no privilege. I was not the one in charge there. My race was not the one in charge there. This is a place, this is a home for a bunch of beautiful black people. And I felt welcome, but I also felt out of sync. And I felt, my God, is this what it's like to be black? Being the only black person in a classroom, being the only black person at a game somewhere, nothing like that. A real eye opener for me, to be without privilege. And I've thought on that many years. So anyway, those are my two little stories. But they were real eye openers for me, because I had never experienced, either in the positive or in the negative, what it was like to be the only one. Anyway, that's my story. Anybody else? I'll open that to the congregation, right? I'm in the wrong building. Where are you, Margaret?
Hi, I'm here.
Okay, let's go with it then.
Okay, we still waiting for a few questions to come in. Some are formulating now. I see people typing. But in the meantime, there was a comment. If you don't mind, I can read that out. It's from Rainboat is the name. They spoke about racism, how racism is not a personality trait. And this is really related to one of our previous forums that we had about what is racism. So what they stated was, it is an action that promotes unequal rights and treatment of another group of people. And a person can act in a racist manner in one situation and later in an anti-racist manner in a different situation. So we are not divided into groups of people who are racist or not racist. Instead, whether the actions are intentional or unintentional, that are either racist or anti-racist. So with that statement, would anyone would like to reply back? It's not really a question, it's really a comment.
No. What we're doing now is I see Chris's hand, okay, and then we will move into the audience participation part. Chris, go ahead.
I can't wait for the audience participation because this is very awkward for me. I got to admit, I would love to us be sitting in a circle and all be sitting face to face because really I'm at equal with the audience here. You know, I mean, that's one of the reasons I have the email down here is I don't want that wall there, and I'm used to just interacting with people, and I don't really consider I'm just a white American citizen trying to fumble through this like a lot of people. I think Marie, or Unknown Rainbow, put it pretty well. I mean, no, some other people showed up. But I think that's a wonderful point. And I think it's something that we discussed a little bit when we were in our meeting last is I at least personally feel that, you know, I know it's so hard for white folks to hear the word racist or that idea was racist or that comment was racist. But it's one of those things that I know it hurts, but you got to kind of get a little bit more comfortable hearing it, because how can someone ask you to improve or say that made me uncomfortable, or I'm questioning what you said if they can't use, if they're barred from using certain words, you know? And I think that's a wonderful idea that recognizing that people are dynamic and we're all evolving in different directions. And, you may be very evolved and enlightened in one way and then have problems in other ways. So I think that was a wonderful comment and something we all have to remember, that this isn't a forever condemnation. This is a learning. So I thought that was a beautiful, beautiful comment.
I don't see any hands up. I did make a mistake, Margaret, with Miss Emery. I would like her to be able to voice her thing. I don't see it on the chat, but we'll make one exception because it was my mess. I take ownership for that. Miss Emery, you had a comment.
I think we all need to think about what kind of experiences we share with our kids. I'm a psychologist that did a lot of the work, but way before that, spent a lot of my early years in hospitals in a city, got to know many people. But the big thing was I went to Chicago, and Chris and I have talked about this, to work right out of college. And my teenage brother came to visit me, and he looked at me. He said, "We're the only white people on this bus." And I said, "And tonight there's two of us." And kind of lights went off in his head. And I think it was just having those experiences. My husband was doing work on the west side of Chicago, social justice work. And when we came here, I had to work hard to teach my kids how to respond when they heard people called the N-word and they heard people using those words, because we lived in a Black neighborhood. And it was just really thought-provoking. It's taken me many years to realize Chicago did not need white people telling them what to do. Part of what I feel I should be doing, and I'm certainly not that good at it, is to make sure the people in my life know that I have rules about those things and why. And I think that's important that we model that as white people to other white people. No, that's not okay. Stop. And it's hard here sometimes, particularly I mean, it is hard here, and some of us know that. All of us know that, particularly in the last couple months. So anyway, thank you for letting me speak. I just wanted to say that. And I love being in Watertown, but and one of the recommendations I make to my family, to the young people in the family, is everyone should live someplace for a while where they are in the minority. And just about everyone has done it. And the learning that takes place, if you're the only person who's not Latino, if the only person who's not Chinese, and you go through that for a couple months, just like you were saying, you learn some things, Chris. It's like, whoa, okay, this is different. And I think those understandings you carry with you in a really positive way.
Thank you, Ms. Emery. From this point on, I would really appreciate it if you would use the chat system. Margaret will send that to me, and then I will address it to any member that you choose, or just throw it out into the ether, and somebody will probably grab it. Okay, let's open it to the audience then. I have a question here, and I open this to anyone. I think somebody addressed it. Becky, I think you should be the one to answer this one. Here's the question. I was wondering about the infant mortality rate. What do you believe caused this, if not the lack of access to healthcare?
The infant mortality rate is twice that nationwide. In some inner city areas, the infant mortality rate is 3 times that for African American mothers as for white mothers. And so they've done studies where they control for health care. So you could assume that it's not based on the degree, what kind of health care the mother is getting. It's not based on the mother's social class or educational level. It's just that the mother is African American, not white. Now, what explains it? High blood pressure tends to run more in African American families than in white families. And there are, but we don't want to, we have to be careful what path we go down here, because some people will turn that around and blame the African American family for eating too much fried chicken. That's racist. That's not what it is at all. There's a psychological wage to being African American in this country. It's like something, I think Ed hinted at this, it's kind of like being in a constant state of PTSD. And that has an impact on your body's ability to function, on your ability to be healthy. I would ascribe it to that African Americans in this country are living in a kind of a constant state of PTSD, where they always have to be on watch. They always have to be careful, because you never know when something might happen. And that's stressful. It's the stress of being Black.
Chris?
So this one, I feel as a science professor, I actually can partially answer. And I'm at least one aspect of it that I know about from direct experience, and it ties into why Black people are dying at twice the rate of white people from COVID as well. So I worked for a while in Chicago public schools in science education, and it was terrible. I mean, it was just not a good learning environment that was set up there. I mean, you have 30 students that are all impoverished, that are all dealing with, I had a 4th grader bring a gun to school because his brother was in a gang, and that was in a Chicano neighborhood, a Mexican American neighborhood. But I mean, it's true also in Black neighborhoods and all sorts of, areas of the Chicago public school system. the lack of science education plays a huge role. The lack of understanding of proper medical care and the lack, there's just a base education missing in the sciences and understanding how your body works. And that starts predominantly at the elementary school level. White schools get a lot more science education resources, and there's a lot more emphasis put there. And as a science educator, that's disgusting to me because it closes off, so many pathways to good career choices. It closes off so many pathways to making good medical choices, good health choices, good, all sorts of different choices are closed off when you remove science education from a child's education, that you don't put a good foundation there. So there is a lot of education disparity, and I've seen it in the city of Chicago. And I think that's partially a role is, like lack of access to care is a big part of it. And then not having a good foundation of understanding how the human body works, understanding, this is not normal. Everybody in my family has this thing. Well, it's not normal and you need to go to a doctor. Lack of insurance, which is a huge issue in this country. So all of these factors kind of play into this high mortality, both with COVID and infant mortality and general mortality, and the 30-year differential you were talking about in Chicago life expectancies.
Thank you, Chris. I have several chats that have popped up here. So let's look at them one at a time. This might be redundant, but the question is simple. What is your definition of white privilege? This is a personal question.
For clarification, that question was addressed to Chris Eby.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
So my personal definition of white privilege is simply that there are biases built in the system, either consciously or unconsciously, and we need to be made aware of those biases so that we can address those biases. Sometimes, a simple example, okay? For most of America's history, Black people weren't allowed to tell their own stories. They just weren't. They weren't given access to publications. They didn't have the resources. For a huge chunk, they were literally silenced. And even now, where we hear a lot more Black voices, most white people are exposed to Black voices that have been already passed through a white filter. So like New York Times has a nearly all white editorial board. The Atlantic has nearly an all white editorial board. So when they choose the Black voices that they're going to choose, they're choosing voices that represent the white values, the white perspectives of what a Black voice should sound like. And that gives white people, particularly white people who live in nearly all white areas and don't have a whole lot of, don't have Black friends, Black colleagues, Black, or other races, Chicano colleagues, all of that, it causes a biased perspective, okay? So you have this image of how people are that doesn't necessarily match up with the individual that's standing in front of you. I honestly think that with white privilege, a huge thing that white people always can do, and I'm always like, let's not just talk about it, let's do something. A big thing that white people can do that's very simple but incredibly powerful is to listen. That means reading Black authors, and that means reading Black publications, but even more than that is listening to Black voices that are around you, that work around you, fellow students, that sort of thing. Listen to what their experiences are without putting judgment on it. Understand that their experience is their experience and really listen to their perspectives, because you learn a lot and from just listening to people. And I encourage everyone to listen to everyone, any politically, racially, anything. But I think for this particular topic, listening to voices other than your own is important.
Thank you, Chris. This looks like an open-ended question. And I quote, white privilege can still be given to white Americans. I, as a black woman, can still be in line with a white making the same income and still feel in last place. Poor white Americans. Jane Elliott did sorry, I can't read that. Jane Elliott did an experiment on white privilege. I need to open that to an expert who knows who Jane Elliott is.
Jane Elliott was a school teacher, and she did an experiment called the brown eye, blue eye experiment, where she separated her students by their eye color. And she treated them a certain way, depending on who would be on the top and who would be the subordinate group. And she did this and she reversed it with brown-eyed kids being on the top the first day, then blue-eyed kids being on the top the second day. And the experiment proved that when a group feels that they're superior or dominant, they perform better. The kids who were not oppressed at the time, and they were going through their classroom skill testing, they were performing at a much higher rate. But then there was also a social aspect to it, where the kids started calling each other brown eyes. And she asked, you never called them brown eyes before, why now? Because it became a derogatory term that they could use. And so, yes, it's the same group. I think the question was about being a black person with making the same amount of money, but it's not an economic thing. You can still be lesser. And basically that's what her experiment was showing, that when someone's given a dominant position, they most of the time attempt to dominate the other group.
Other panel comments on that?
It also works in the reverse. What we find historically is that poor white folk tend to gravitate towards racism because it gives them a sense of superiority when economically they feel that they're sliding, right? And so if you track, for example, Klan membership, it mirrors economic calamity times or uncertainty. And if we got our current era, part of that is the destabilization of what's happening in our own economy now. In terms of, if we casually talk about things like motorized, computerized cars and trucks, but there are people who think that that's their livelihood, and in those environments, you've got to really work against racism, because otherwise, it's something that folks latch onto. Quite frankly, it gives them a sense of solace, a sense of superiority that they'll cling to. I would suggest.
Would you consider it a form of shorthand language, which becomes prejudicial language?
How so?
Well, I mean,
there's definitely shorthand.
Yeah.
People from the city. I'm from Albany.
Oh, he's just a farmer.
Say again?
Or he's just a farmer. The implications with that are astounding. Anyway, I'm in dairy country up here, and I know several millionaire farmers. So to think in terms of just say he's a farmer, what does that imply? He's dumb, he's dirty, he's grubbing around in the earth. Not necessarily so. Tain't necessarily so, as they say. But that shorthand all of us use from time to time, because we're all in a hurry. I don't know. I don't see any other hands open up here. Okay, let's go to the next question. In my experience, many people talk about their friends and identify them by race, ethnicity, sex, or gender. Isn't that biased in itself? I have hundreds of friends, but don't identify any of them by their race, but by their actions. Would it be safe to say that as long as we identify by race, ethnicity, or sex, we will always be biased? Good question. Anybody want to grab that? Chris?
So this is something I've struggled with too. I think a lot of white people are pretty uncomfortable, especially in conversations like what you don't want to say is like, I have a black friend, like that's like a classic, like, I'm trying to cover up I'm racist, like kind of that might as well be like code for that. And we all understand that, and it makes us uncomfortable to even talk about race. I think, so I'm a spiritual person. And as a spiritual person, I'm also a religious person. I go to church pretty often. And I do believe there is a transcendent self that goes beyond race, that goes beyond gender, that goes beyond sexual identity, any of those things. But the fact is that we live in a world, that's the self that I think God sees. But we live in a world that we have these identifiers, I mean, like, I can't pretend that I'm not white. It's the first thing people are going to notice about me. Someone who's black can't walk into a grocery store and not have people notice that. I mean, what are they going to take off their skin? So they're going to notice that they're black. So we have all these different identifiers, and some of them are more clear than others. Like, for example, if you're gay, and you're out with your boyfriend, someone's going to notice that you're gay, and these identifiers, these identities are part of who we are in everyday life, right? They're part of our larger identity. I think understanding that every human being is a huge, limitless community of identities, okay? I am white, but I'm also a professor. I am also a geologist. I love rocks. I also am a huge origami fan. I love to fold little paper animals and that kind of stuff. And understanding that when that race isn't a dirty word, and describing someone by their race is just one identifier in a whole slew of identities that you may not know, you don't know if you only know the person's race. So I know it's uncomfortable to talk about, but it's just, it is an identity. And it's an identity that changes the way that someone's going to experience life in a profound way in this country. A black man is going to experience life very differently than I am. So yeah, I know that's really hard. And I know that what tends to be is to lean away from that identifier at all and say, oh, I'm not going to talk about race and I'm not going to identify people by their race at all. But we have to recognize that the reality is in this society that people are going to identify your race and gender, and it's going to be the first thing people know about you. So, and that influences the way that your life is going to play out.
Thank you. Other comments on that issue? Another question. How would you approach someone who is hateful, or racist? How do you help someone understand or learn empathy?
I think it's part of what children learn early. I think it's learned to, I don't think it's genetic. I think, and there can be subtle things that shape a child in one direction or another.
Most of us do most of our communication with adults, not with children. We can see how children can be taught in one way or another and learn to be biased, learn to be prejudiced. How do you approach someone who's already an adult, already a, quote, formed, end quote, human being who is very prejudiced, and how do you get them to think in terms of what it means to be empathetic?
Think about children that get a pet when they're very young. And they require some supervision if they're 2 or 3 because they're getting too enthusiastic and they might pull kitty's tail and get bitten. But if they have responsibility for that pet And they learn that that pet has feelings just like they do. And they learn that that pet can get hurt just like they can. Then they might tend to grow up as a more empathetic adult. Think about the studies that have been done, and this is going on in prison systems, where they take hardened criminals and they give them a dog to train. And they learn to, and they live with that dog, and they're responsible for that dog. And they learn from that dog that another living being is dependent upon them and has feelings and offers love and affection back when it's given love and affection. And sometimes they have prison training programs for training wild horses. And the same thing happens because the hardened prisoners who are totally unempathetic and utterly selfish, well, not all of them, but many of them, learn that that animal needs care and affection and responds with love back. So maybe that's how we can teach people as adults to be empathetic. And then think about President Trump, who never had a pet as a child. Yeah, Ron, I know.
Chris, I see your hand.
Yeah, I'm going to kind of take a slightly different tack than Becky and Ron started. So I think that the racist that we all as white folks need to be number one concerned with, and this is going to hurt, but it's real, is the one in the mirror. And I know that sounds really, really, really hard. And I know that sounds really, really complicated. And white people get very, white people love to call other white people racist. The reality is we all have different hangups and we all have different preconceived notions. And no matter how enlightened you think you are, there's always room to grow for every single one of us. You know, I would say that just by being on the Voices Committee and having the conversations that we did over the summer helped me grow, okay? And talking about these things helped me grow. That being said, when you're talking to someone, I really like the comment about, you know, a person can be racist in one way and not another, or against one non-white group and not against another, and that it's a complicated thing. And I think starting with the question, can you see how someone might see what you said as racist? Start it as a question so that they can explore it themselves a little bit before they answer you. Because sometimes, occasionally, once in a great while, you totally misheard them and misunderstood. That happens, okay? What's more likely is, for example, it's something their grandparents said. We all have grandparents or great-grandparents that we listen to and we love very much, and it can be very hard to understand that some of the things that were said by the people we love were very closed-minded. You know, and reflecting, oh, geez, yeah, my grandpa used to say that, but that's probably not cool. Also, you might identify them as just a straight up troll. Some people say horrible, horrible things in order to get attention. That's a real phenomenon. And they might be trying to bait you to get that negative attention. Those sorts of people, the only thing you can do is walk away because they're sick. They have a problem. And you're just going to waste your energy and get really frustrated trying to argue with them.
Thank you. Here's another question. What is a snappy comeback for the following question? When I have experienced a threat as an attempted shakedown or robbery, the first question to me has been, were they Black? My initial reaction is to grab the person by the throat and shake and ask, should I feel relief if the threatening individual is white? Grab hold of that one. where does the threat come from? Just a minute, Chris. Where does the threat or the fear of threat come from? Is it all internal? I don't think so. But is it all external?
I was going to ask a historian to speak. Ron or Josh. Josh is out there in the audience somewhere to speak about the assumptions, the stereotypes that have worked their way into American society about the behavior of Black men, especially during Reconstruction. And then we get to Birth of a Nation. So let's ask a historian to talk about that for a moment.
If I were to address it, I would actually broaden it out. And there's many colors, many flavors, and particularly I'm much more comfortable talking about Native Americans in this context, and rightfully so. I mean, if you look at it for mortality rates, they have the highest. There's ample examples of voter suppression against Native American votes, particularly in the Midwest. Highest levels of disease and actual physical segregation. So, and it goes back from contact, right? Similar images or similar stereotypes of, for example, the quote unquote lack of hard work, lack of initiative, is a result of Europeans arriving and trying to impose agriculture on people who had agriculture for 600 years already. But women did the farming. And then that, because men were engaged in other activities, that's cast as natives being lazy or shifty. And those stereotypes, I mean, if you look at, I talk in my class at least about the notion of the shuffle. The quote unquote shuffle to me is an act of defiance. The reality is, if you were dragged from your village, put on a boat, watch 60% of the boat die while you continue to travel on that boat, put on a block, sold, I don't think I'd be getting up and running to work every morning. I think it was an act of defiance, which tried to keep you from getting beaten to death, but still not comply. But that then gets converted into a negative stereotype. So, those, and we can see them in the media. I mean, particularly, again, if I do Native American cinema, the image of a Native American in the 1950s is extremely different than Dances with Wolves. And people weren't going around with dream catchers. And so we do find that images can change over time. They are malleable. I guess it'd be kind of a constructivist perspective on issues of identity as well.
In what way? Sorry, clarification, Ron. You say they're malleable. You mean they can change with age, or they can change with situational? What are you talking about?
That cultural attitudes towards different cultures can change over time. Absolutely. And part of that may be a demographic issue. Part of that can be awareness development, interaction. I think there's multiple examples. And you can even look at some of the earlier civilizations were wickedly cosmopolitan, and a variety of different peoples coexisting. Race, I would argue, that the in-out group dynamic and all that we just kind of were referring to earlier is maybe part of human nature, but we have found ways historically to overcome those. And there are societies who may have not solved this problem, are dealing with it much more effectively and better than we are. I would suggest.
That fits in very well with the comment from someone in the audience who simply said, in reaction to a former question, how do you help someone understand or learn empathy? It simply says it is learned. He's saying prejudice is a learned behavior. And one would assume that as we age, we continue to learn. We're constantly learning. We'll learn to the day we die. Can people change? Even if we learn, do they use it? Chris?
I just wanted to address the last question as well. first, I want to say thank you for sharing, and to the person who said that. And I'm sorry you went through a very scary experience that's now getting made even more complicated by the questions you're being asked. And you are never in any obligation to answer any questions about any kind of traumatic event ever. But if you want to, it may not be the snappiest comeback, but it's a very simple comeback. Just ask them why. Make them just be like, why? And make them justify themselves. Because I don't think they can without saying what's in their deeper mind. But you don't have to answer anything. You don't have to justify anything. You were the one that was attacked.
I have to introduce something that really shocked me many years ago, and it was a prominent Black leader was speaking to a large audience and told a story on himself. I thought he was very brave to tell the story. He was walking down a dark street. It was in Baltimore. I just remember that much. It was in Baltimore, and he heard these footsteps behind him, and they were getting closer and closer and closer. And he said to himself, as he turned, he says, I hope it's a white man. Now there's a Black leader. And then the reason he told this, because he actually said to himself, oh my God, I am sorry I ever thought that. And he was trying to lay out to his audience, boy, was that a confession of the first order that I heard from him. And he was really embarrassed to have to reveal that thought that jumped into his mind. Anyway, I don't know how to explain that. I don't want to explain it. I just am very proud of him for revealing his fear, and that his fear had been conditioned by some kind of social pressure, even though he was of African American lineage. Anyone want to comment on that?
Okay, there's a very good article by Ta-Nehisi Coates. I must know who Ta-Nehisi Coates is, right? And it's in the Atlantic, and it's called The Black Family in the Age of Mass Incarceration. It's of roughly 2015, approximately. But if you just Google Coates, mass incarceration, Black family, and you'll run across it. And in that article, Coates has a very good section on something that I've tried to mention before, and that's the history and how history has impacted our stereotypes and worked its way into the culture of young Black men in particular. So, or some of Ta-Nehisi Coates' other books are good too. But I liked The Black Family in the Age of Mass Incarceration. It's a very good article. I recommend it to you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Question. Okay, here's the question. We're talking about white privilege in Black and white terms, but white privilege in this country also greatly affects Asians, Hispanics, Middle Easterners, etc. Also, the issue of white privilege is ingrained into every aspect of life. The cause and effect of it run deep in the fabric of this country. Anybody can answer this. Frailty. I see Ms. Smiley. I know we're supposed to, but do you have a comment that you wanted to make on that?
Yes, throughout this whole conversation, it just brought up so many memories. And for me, and I wrote it in a comment, that I learned more about being prejudiced is from my own experiences of just living my life as a kid and as an adult. And it is in the recognizing and the allowing myself to see my own prejudices when they rise in me. I may speak about them, I may not, that I learn how to sort that out for myself. When I was a young kid, when I grew up in Watertown here, and also went to private Christian schools throughout my youth, through my high school years. And in both of those experiences, the first was my brother was married, and they had a sunshine child one summer, and brought the child to our house, and we were a big family. But at any rate, they brought this little fellow, and he was black. I had never seen, talked, heard, or anything about a black person. We younger kids were just, holy cow. We wanted to touch him like you would something really foreign or something different, because geez, I've never seen anyone with hair like that or skin like that. It was just a pure curiosity. But I certainly felt he was different from me. He looked a whole bunch different than I. I didn't have any thoughts about it one way or another, nor did I say anything, but I certainly saw him as different. Never talked about it, but it's something I've never forgotten. I'm 76 years old, and I can still bring up that experience.
Sure.
That, because it was a shock to me. I don't think I ever saw a picture of a black person, let alone see one growing up. My next one was not that, but when I was in high school, a really, really good friend of mine, and I grew up in the late 50s and 60s, was gay. But I didn't know it for a long time. And when we found out that, I did not know how to handle that. I certainly had, there's something wrong with this. Now, it wasn't something that was taught in schools as different genders are today. It was not an open subject. But we were aware of it as teenagers to some degree. But I pushed this kid. We were just such good friends, but I pushed him away. I didn't know what else to do. And I spent years that bothering me as I grew and recognized my own prejudices for what they were and what I can do about them. Ask questions, talk about it. I think the biggest thing for me is recognizing my own prejudices and making decisions about them, and working at letting them go. Forgiving myself, I think they've just arisen lots of times. I've tried, I even worked very hard at apologizing to him. I don't even know if he was aware of it, but and I did try to talk to him about it once, and he wasn't interested. He was more interested in my twin sister and what she was up to. This was a long time later. I also, when I was teaching schools at the age in on the same subject, when AIDS came into being and all the discrimination and prejudice arose around a disease, and the people who had the disease, which were gay men in particular. And I was teaching at the time, and they were even talking about them, although it was subtle, whether it would be a good idea to have particularly gay men, more than women, teaching in schools because of their interactions with children, which is really prejudicial. And I had to figure that one out for myself in terms of, we're just people. Gay men are not pedophiles any more than who knows what makes a pedophile. But once I recognized and sorted out, and that's what I think we all have to do, what is keeping someone in a box, keeping that distance, or asking those questions. Now, I didn't bring this up at meetings or probably anywhere. Once I could make my decisions about my own thinking, then I could change my actions. But until I do that and can see the prejudice in the first place, the prejudice continues unless I
Thank you.
recognize him. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Smiley.
Yeah.
We've got a list of questions here, and we've got to move on here so that everybody can be heard. Okay, this is a long question, so listen for the question. My struggle is how to work toward promoting equality and fighting racism when I witness it, especially when it involves microaggressions. I know that my silence or inaction is anti-racist by default, but I don't always know what to do. One situation I have been struggling with here, I have observed white adults who have continually mistaken a friend of mine who is a young black male as someone else, usually a random black male recently met. The young male has been part of my community and has volunteered and worked closely with these white adults for many years. These white adults don't mix up other white people's names. I know their absent-mindedness is unconscious, but their attitude comes off as all black men look alike. And I don't think they take the time to really look my friend in the eye and just get to know him. It angers and saddens me to see the hurt. He only shares the hurt with me. I am looking to feedback as to how to talk to these other white adults without alienating, yet really address issues. Well, the question here is, how does she talk to her white friends about her young black male friend without alienating people? Chris?
So I'm pretty sure I know the questioner. I'm pretty sure I know the young black man. I'm pretty sure I know the community. So it hits home, and it kind of goes a little bit into what Ms. Smiley was saying, which I want to touch on a little bit. I lived in Denmark for 5 years, and I am very clearly not Danish. I am not tall. I am not shaped. I do not look like a Danish woman. Okay, let's just put it that way. No one's going to mistake me for a Scandinavian. And so I've been the poked and the prodded and the stared at. And because the Danes it's a very homogeneous culture, meaning everybody is very similar to one another. It's just, I mean, they've been Danes since the end of the last glaciation and living together. So they, you know, they're a little racist. They're a lot racist sometimes. Some of the cartoons and stuff you see in the newspaper are pretty blatantly racist. And so being the poked and the prodded one and the petted and the questioned isn't fun, especially if you're living that every single day. And I know Helen was just talking about like how she grew from that. Ms. Smiley was talking about how she grew from that and how she understood that. But I just wanted to emphasize that that's something that, you know, Black people and Latino people, you know, Latino being this huge category, but particularly Chicanos, Mexican Americans living in Watertown are experiencing. One of the speakers said something about, you know, what about Asian Americans? When I was dating an Asian American, people in Watertown came up to him and were like, "What are you?" You know, like, you know, and he was pretty cool with it. But I could understand how that would get really overwhelming after, I mean, he was also a super extrovert and just kind of liked the attention, honestly. But if you were a shyer, more introverted person, that would be terrifying. So getting to that particular question with the community, talk to them. And if you're having trouble talking to them, talk to me, because I'm about 98% sure that I am a member of that same community. And I am very happy to try to delicately and clearly correct some of the very loving older white folks that are members of that community that keep making that mistake.
Thank you. Our next question. What would be the most realistic way for us to help alleviate the suffering of Black people as a result of this issue? This issue really addresses the issue, of course, of white privilege. How can we help the Black community come to terms with that or respond to it?
I would suggest it's kind of white privilege-y to ask how white people can do that, in part. And I think at the end, it's extending, and recognizing common humanity at some point. There's always in and out groups, right? Even when we say Asian Americans within the Asian communities, there's prejudice amongst themselves. Before Europeans arrived, there wasn't a term, there wasn't racism in America because there was only one people, but there was still conflict. And there was in-out groups, and there were tribal, and there were sub-tribal, and moieties, and the rest. So while I don't think it's genetic, it is very human to have your in groups and your out groups, and you define who you are, and sometimes you're defined from the outside. I think the common theme is, for the last couple questions, is you got to be honest. If your friends are not calling your other friend by their right name and confusing them, make sure you call him by his right name in front of them, and with a wry smile if necessary to let him know. You need to pull people aside from time to time, and it can be done non-confrontational. You don't have to point out how wrong they are. You just tell them what they're doing, and let them kind of work their way to the wrongness of it. But if you ignore it, silence is acceptance. And so there's a responsibility for all people to do that, though. Right? I mean, if I'm with a Japanese friend and he's talking smack about Koreans, I'm going to call him on that as well. Right? There has to be that honesty and openness for this really to work in the long run, and the Common Core is accepting our commonality. I mean, I think it might have been Nixon actually, or Reagan. I think it was Reagan who once said that the only thing that would bring mankind together is the arrival of aliens, and at that point we'd all be human race because we'd have someone else that we could compare ourselves to, and then that would bring our unity. Hopefully, that's not required. Right? The commonalities there, the prejudice is out there, and it shouldn't consume you, but you need to be engaged, I would suggest. And if nothing else, you'll sleep better that night, knowing that you tried.
Good. Thank you, Ron. The question is, why is talking about white privilege and racism uncomfortable to whites when Blacks must conform to it and almost say nothing about it? That's an interesting remark.
Ego. I mean, I'm not a psychologist, I'm a sociologist, but white people don't want to talk about it or do anything about it, partly because it's a challenge to one's own ego, one's own image of self, and nobody wants to think about themselves as having racist thoughts. But as someone pointed out before, maybe Chris, we're socialized into a country, into a society that does have those in groups and out groups Ron was talking about. So we learn all that stuff from a very young age. It takes time to overcome it, like Helen was talking about. It takes time and self-reflection to overcome it.
That requires an open mind. What if somebody has a closed mind and you really don't feel that you can, or for whatever reason, can be a messenger of openness? Go ahead, Chris.
So I'll throw in for why it makes white people uncomfortable. and also recognize, I'm trying to be as, empathetic and as possible, but I also want to say openly that I recognize that I'm asking people of color. People of color are constantly told that they have to ask to be treated like a human in the most polite and right way possible. And that in and of itself is kind of dehumanizing to them. So, I kind of feel that coming out of that question that like, well, I'm living with this. Why is it so hard for you to deal with? It goes back to the dirty stove, man. Like the fire alarm's going off. Why are you shaming me about my dirty stove? I'm not shaming you. It just needs to get cleaned. But the natural human inclination is something's wrong that is in my power, that's under my domain, and I'm going to feel ashamed for it. Some of my students, when they get an F on a test, they feel ashamed. I don't want them to feel ashamed. I want them to be aware that it's a problem and that they need to do better and they need to study harder and they need to work harder, but I don't want them to feel ashamed or guilty. But that's one of the reasons I emphasize that I don't want you to feel ashamed or guilty about white privilege. I want you to be aware of white privilege, because shame and guilt make us like lean away and be like, I don't want to listen, that sort of a thing. So also just, nobody likes to be the bad guy in the story. And a lot of white people, when they hear racism, they picture, guys in pointy white hats galloping around, setting fire to crosses, and they're like, oh, I'm not that person. Well, I'm not saying that you're that person. I'm saying what you said wasn't cool or was narrow-minded or was making a broad generalization about people or something like that. So I think it's a variety of different factors, but a lot of it is just embarrassment. When your eyes are turned to it, you look at it and you're like, just like the dirty stove. And then the other part of it is what that word racist means, which I think a lot of white people hear racist and they think evil, horrible, rather than you're thinking wrong. Okay, you made a mistake. You need to correct that mistake. You need to grow from that mistake.
Thank you. Here's another question almost along the same track. What are some practical ways white people can practice being aware of their privilege as well as using it to be anti-racist? It's like any skill. It's a learned thing. So what does it mean to be aware? I'd like to open that to anybody who's on this screen.
Hello, Jerry. I would like to speak.
Go ahead, Margaret.
So awareness, the day-to-day activities, often you have to be aware of your own actions. And it could be minor, it could be small. And you just have to be cautious of that. And one example would be, we all have different intersectionalities as far as our identities. And for me, I'm Black and female. So one of the things I've noticed that's a cross between that. So something as simple as getting on the elevator, and I've noticed in my past experience that a white male will hold the elevator for the female, white female. But then often the elevator is not held for me, Black female. And it could be the same elevator in the same building, the building I'm in, work in day to day. So it's the same environment, but yet it's common. So just being aware of your surroundings, and also when you notice something happening, you have to think about your reaction, what you would do if you were in that situation, how you will react differently, how you can react in a way that will improve the situation. And then in the midst of identifying your surroundings, you are also identifying any bias you may have. And you may not recognize it. It just may be normal day-to-day things you do, and you may not really realize there's a bias there. So now you have to make an effort to make a correction to that bias. And as you're working on yourself to improve it, regardless of what color you are, You also may be helping the people around you to make improvements as well. So with your friends, with your circle of people, your network, your coworkers, you're then pointing things out to them as well. And they may say, oh, I didn't notice that before. And then you can explain, well, this is what's happening, even though you didn't notice it, but this is the reaction. So I say part of this is to recognize and be cautious of what's happening in your interaction in your environment.
Thank you, Margaret. How do you build trust? I mean, I'm going to ask a question here. How do you build trust to even begin to think that you could possibly talk to someone when you recognize that you've done something that you really feel stupid about? Like opening the door or holding the door, Margaret, in your case. Or there are a million different ways that we ignore other people and accept others, and we don't even know it, or we may not even be aware of it. It's that sense of awareness of a common humanity. I think it's a sense of awareness of something that transcends gender, race, anything. But I'm a preacher. So the point is that how does somebody who's not a preacher talk about this to their cohorts when they're drinking coffee down by the machine and say to them, you know, you kind of snubbed Miss Jones out there when you were getting into the elevator. Why'd you do that? You might say, geez, I didn't even notice it. Go ahead, Chris.
So it's building trust and raising awareness. I think Margaret said it absolutely beautifully. It's just being a little bit more alert and aware of your surroundings. That's a part of it. But another thing, and that gets to the trust thing, is listening. Like, you've got to listen, and I mean to everyone. And I know that's hard. And you hear them out, and then I have we'll call him a very good friend who's a nurse. And he always says that listening is a form of loving. And it's very true. Huh?
Nothing. I interrupted you. And
oh, no, it's okay. Listening is a form of loving, and listening to people is really a big part of it. So if someone like Margaret brings that up to me, and I say, well, what is there something like, so for example, someone's being rude to her now, or just being ignorant, you know, if she brings that up to me, now my next question is, can I help in some way, shape, or form? So that's one of the ways a listener can help build trust with your friends, is if they're really your friends, they will love you even if you tell them that they're wrong. Like, real friends can handle that. And if they can't handle hearing, hey, I kind of noticed that you're treating one of our colleagues differently than another, then they're not really your friend. And some people are just going to not listen. And once again, don't feed the trolls, because there are people who do jerky things just to get attention. Mm-hmm. And you can only walk away from those folks. Yeah. But if you're talking to your friends, you should be able to say, hey, that's not cool, because that's what friends do, is bring up things like that.
The reason I interrupted you is because you made me laugh, because when what that is I'm getting tongue-tied here. That quotation that you said, talking to one another is loving one another, it's an African proverb. And talking requires being aware, but it also requires courage. And when you become aware, I think, you suddenly are aware of another person opening to you, and you need to have the courage, or try to find the courage, or develop the courage to be able to reply with a sense of trust that person would not have opened to you without some sense of respect. And it's a matter of being genuinely human rather than protective of our faults. There's a lot been said today. I think several of you are very courageous in being out front and being able to express your own vulnerabilities and efforts to see who you are and how that affects others and how it affects the way you see them. So we close out with an invitation to continue the conversation because it's one that we really need to continue. So with that, I say to you, I hope you have a pleasant evening. I hope that you have learned something from this particular conversation, and we will be offering more conversations later on. And hang in there, because this entire topic and all of our relationships are constantly changing and in motion, and we can direct the motion that they take. That's the end, I think.